Hi there. Now let's talk a little bit more about how we're going to write this ozone briefing. All right, so this slide deck gives you some really useful information about the actual writing part of this. So let's take a look at this. First of all, we have two sections that I call part one better writing, and then part two is more specific for the ozone briefing paper. As handouts, I have some tips and tricks for writing, and of course the actual briefing paper as well. Start with our little tip sheet here. Now let's talk about writing. And the first thing, of course, you want to do is to make some sort of outline, right? Writing is a process, right? You can't just sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to write this thing. Well, you can, but that's probably not going to work so well. So writing is a process that you do over, several days, right? You start, you go away, you do it again, So you go through this process here. And of course, the key part here is this idea, give it to a reader. If you want to write well, and I can move this up here, the key part really is give your draft to somebody else to read, right? So try to build that in somehow. Now, for this particular briefing, right, the challenge, of course, is that you really have to answer or address all these four parts, right? You have to, first of all, answer the question that the president asks you. Then you have to explain to the president why you answer that question. You have to explain who cares and what else. So you have to give the answer, you have to give an explanation, you have to explain the relevance and the implications, and then the connections. All that, of course, in 250 words. And you can support that by two figures. So that's the challenge here. It's really easy to write something like this in 3, 4, 5 pages. The challenge here is to write it in 250 words, which is basically no more than 3/4 of a page. Depends a little bit on fonts. Right? Cover page, right? Pretty straightforward. That's page 1. Create a cover page. Title of your work, your name, your campus-wide ID number, the course, what this is for, and the date, something like that. So, you can just make yourself a template and then reuse that cover page for every assignment, for every paper that you will write for the next 4 years. So set that up once and then you can reuse it. Citations, right? Obviously, that's something you need to do because a lot of this material is not is not something that you have originally come up with, but rather you've borrowed it from somebody. So you have to give these people credit. So that's the idea of citations. The rest is just formalities. Now, the only time you don't have to cite is here. Common knowledge you can find in any basic textbook and your own personal work or opinion. So here's the thing. A lot of this knowledge, information related to the basic ozone hole and ozone and global warming, you don't really have to cite because it is basic knowledge that you can find in a chapter in every basic textbook, right? So, you don't have to get too crazy here with the citations because again, you're dealing with basic common knowledge. So be aware of that. If you're going to cite, don't stress about it, right? All you need is some sort of consistent, systematic system that provides sufficient information so that the reader can find your source. There's like hundreds of systems out there, right? Of citation systems. You use whatever system you like, right? The one that you feel comfortable with, that you know how to do. Again, there's hundreds of them. So it's really kind of pointless to get too obsessed about the citation system. If you don't have a citation system that you've used, if this is all new to you, then use the APA system. Look that up. It's pretty straightforward. And of course, if you cite, right, you have a bibliography at the end with the full citation. And then in the text, you have a parentheses, you cite it like this, Bergen 1991. And then, of course, when you go to the bibliography, you find the full citation for this particular article. So that's how you handle that. Because it's just, you don't want the full citation in the text. That's just klutzy. So that's why you have the full citation in the bibliography and you just reference to it in parentheses here. All right. Super important, figures, right? Any kind of professional writing will have figures, whether that's business reports, business plans, scientific papers, whatever will have figures, right? Any kind of non-fiction writing. So you have to handle figures. Now, figures are just information that's conveyed graphically. So those could be photographs, those could be cartoons, those could be graphs or charts, those could be flowcharts or diagrams or maps or whatever the case might be, right? All of those things are generically called figures. And the only trick here is to handle them properly, right? And it's really not that hard, right? One thing about figures, really, take care of your figures. Figures are hugely important, right? So spend the time, find good figures. Here's actually a good quote, right? The figures are so important that they're actually more important than your text. Find the figures, organize your paper around it, right? Don't just grab a couple of figures because they're easy to find or they look cool, right? Figures have to do work. Figures have to help you. Figures have to make your argument, illustrate your argument, support your argument. They don't just sit there and look cool, right? So take care of your figures. It's really quite worth it. Formalities are pretty straightforward. There's 5 parts to a figure. The figure itself, obviously, every figure has a figure number, figure 1, figure 2. Every figure has a figure caption, usually about 3 sentences. You have to have the figure source. I showed you that in the previous video. And of course, you have to reference the figure sequentially in the text so that the text and the figure are connected, right? So that's just the way it works. So let's look at an example here. So here is a figure, right? And if you would use this in your Ozone paper, you would call this figure 1, right? And then you'd have to write a figure caption. And in general, when you write a figure caption, you should be writing 3 sentences at least, right? If you only write 1 sentence, the figure caption is probably too short. If you write 5 sentences, it's probably too long, right? What you need to do in your figure caption is, first of all, explain what the figure shows, right? Actually explain it. Don't just assume people understand it. Explain what the figure shows, then what it means, and then what it implies, right? So those are the 3 things that go into a figure caption, and those might be 3 sentences: sentence 1, sentence 2, and sentence 3, right? So important things to remember. The way this looks in a paper. So here's an example, right? It's a little small, but when you look up here, right? For example, here's a sentence, and then here in parentheses, the author cited his figure 1. That's exactly how you do it. So then as you read this, you're like, oh, okay, if I want to see this particular watershed, hey, I can go to figure 1. So that way the figure is connected to the text. That's how you cite figures in your text. Here's another example. The sentence, for example. Right? It doesn't even matter if you understand the sentence. All you need to know that there's a sentence, and then at the end of the sentence in parentheses, figure 5 is referenced. So that tells you that, figure 5 contains information graphically that helps you understand the sentence. Figure 5 is actually up here, it's kind of cut off, right? So that's the way you cite figures in your text. Tables would be handled exactly the same way. You probably don't have tables in this in this briefing, right? Tables are just rows and columns of data. They're not graphical, right? So don't confuse a table with a figure. Completely different. If you have rows and columns of data, that's a table. If you have something graphical or visual, that's a figure. Now, about the briefing paper, again, you can just look at the details. It's very well described, right? The handout has 4 pages. The page 1 gives you the overview and the due date. The format is specifically defined on page 2. Page 3, tips and resources. So if you're unsure how to do an annotated bibliography, there's help there. And then the grading table is on the last page. So you already know what I'm looking for, right? So there's really no reason why you shouldn't get 100 on this, right? Because you know exactly what to do, and you know exactly how it's going to get assessed, right? So follow the instructions, and that should get you towards a pretty good grade. now you want to get started, right? You want to set up your document. You probably have already done this. Find your figures, sources, outline your briefing, and write it. If you run into troubles, give me a shout, right? Again, the Reading and Writing Center would be super useful here. So check these videos out. If you want to make an appointment, this is all explained right here. Just click on this, watch this video. They'll tell you exactly how to make an appointment. Okay? And then finally, I just want you to be aware of deadlines, right? And sort of the idea that you don't want to spend a lot of time in this red phase, because then you're going to find yourself in panic mode and maybe in stressed out mode in order to meet the deadline. So the less time you can waste here, the better you are. Right? The deadline is clear. The deadline is specific. You have plenty of time. So make sure you meet it. Okay? If you run into problems, let me know. Thanks for listening.